All right, good evening, everyone. We're very glad that you were able to join us this evening. As you know, for the last we're continuing on our study on the book of Daniel, and so we're taking Daniel chapter by chapter. And today we're going to be looking at the statue and the dream that the king had. And we're not going to go into all the details because if you've read the book of Daniel, you know that later on we will look at some of the interesting facts and some historical and archaeological facts that lets us know that the Bible is in fact true. So the title for the topic today is Choose Your Citizenship. Now, if you've been listening to the news or if you like to listen to the news, you know that there's a lot of talks about citizenship. And just this week, a friend of mine calls me from California. He was very, very worried. And he's like, you know what the president is going to do with those that have something about the birthright citizenship and all of that. And so he was very worried. And so he was telling me why it is important for him to have a citizenship here in the United States. And so we're going to be looking at the history of the kingdoms and why it's important for us not to focus on where do we have our citizenship here in this earth, but ultimately what we want to have at the very end. And so we're going to start with chapter 2 from Daniel. And we're going to go and we're going to start right off with verse 1. And so it says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake him. So to me it's very interesting that we're here at Nebuchadnezzar's third year. And there's a reason for that later on. We're going to find out that in fact this was Nebuchadnezzar's third year because the way that the Babylonians used to count their government was when a king stepped in, they really didn't count the first year because to them it was more like a year of transition. They really didn't count that year. And so here in Daniel 2, it starts off by letting us know that this is his second year, but in reality, this was his third year. And so all of a sudden, Nebuchadnezzar is here. He's just come up to the kingdom here, and something amazing happens to him. He has this vision, dream. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. One of the interesting things that we see here is that right now the Babylonian kingdom is at its climax. And what do you do when you feel you have it all figured out? He has this dream, and so what do you naturally do? You call the very best of the best of the best that you have in your kingdom, right? And so he goes ahead and calls the best people that he has. And they begin to get worried because he's asking the impossible. You know, it's easy for you to tell somebody what your dream was, and I'm sure you could come up with some brilliant explanation of what it means. But at this time, the king doesn't give them anything. They don't have anything to work with. And so we're going to see what their response is. And so the king says in verse 5, it says, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. So as a king, he's conquered so many governments, so many kingdoms, and what does a good conqueror know how to do? A good conqueror actually knows how to get the things that he wants. And the way that he's proposing to get this done is quite interesting. He's telling them, if you don't do what I'm telling you, I'm not only going to kill you, but I'm going to cut you in pieces. And there's actually historical records of what the Babylonians at that time used to do. And this was kind of like a form of torture. You know, it was easy to go ahead and, kill somebody. But when the Bible talks about cutting somebody into pieces, you can imagine that the individual was alive at every step of the way. Right? They wouldn't just kill him and then chop the pieces. They would chop the pieces little by little. And so, of course, this terrifies the wise men of Babylon. And so they continue to insist, and they want him to tell them what the dream is. And then it says, but if ye show the dream, the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. So now he's telling them, look, if you actually tell me what I need to hear, I'm going to give you honor, I'm going to give you rewards. There's something good at the end of this deal. And so now in verse 8, it says, the king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain time, because ye see the thing is gone from me. And so what they do is now they propose to the king and they tell him, look, give us some time, we're going to come back and we're going to figure this out and we're going to have something for you. And so at this time, the king says, look, I know that all you want to do is buy some time. He had these wise men in Babylon for a reason, right? And so they're asking for time, and later on we're going to see how Daniel's request is actually the same. They both are asking for time, but he grants Daniel the time. But for the wise men, he's like, nope, because I know if you take the time, you're going to come with something up, and I know it's not going to be true. And so now in verse 9, it says, but if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you, for ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. And so what do you think was going through the minds of the magicians and the sorcerers at this time? Nothing like this had ever been asked. And they actually come back to the king, and I can imagine they're trying to negotiate with him because, again, their lives are at stake, but not only their lives, but the way that they're going to die is actually at stake. And so it says, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show you the king's matter. There was one thing that these men actually recognized. And what was that? There's actually nobody that can tell you what you dreamt if you don't tell them what the dream is. And then they said, therefore there is no king, there is no lord, no ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And so now they're coming to realize that this is something that nobody that they know will actually be able to do. But now in verse 11, they begin to kind of realize that there is perhaps some entity out there. And again, remember the Babylonians had their different gods and everything, and so they know at least that there is some entity that will be able to tell them what this dream is. And so they say, it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none other that can show it before the king except what? Except the gods. And of course they believe in several gods, but they know that it's somebody not of this world. All right? So except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. And so now they begin to kind of realize that whatever solution there is to this problem is not going to be from any human being, but it has to be from some entity that is not human. And this is why I like this quote from Ellen White in Acts of the Apostles, where it says, man's extremity, it's God's opportunity. So when we go through difficult times, in this case, the magicians were going through a very difficult time. If they didn't come up with an answer, they were going to lose their lives, right? And so this is when God begins to work with people. Even if you know somebody that does not believe in God or is a little skeptical, always when we come to a point where we need help and nobody that we know is able to help us, this is when we begin to realize how God begins to intervene. Unfortunately, these wise men didn't believe, and so let's go to verse 12 and see what happened. It says, for this cause the king was angry and very furious and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now, remembering what we studied last time that we looked at the first chapter of Daniel, who was the wisest man in Babylon at that time? Who was the wisest man in Babylon at that time? So last month we talked about Daniel and his friends, right? They had this test with the diets that they had, and so they were declared the wisest men in Babylon, 10 times wiser. And so all of a sudden now this decree is in effect, and who do you think is included with a bunch of people that are now going to be cut into pieces? Daniel and his friends were in this list. And so now they come to Daniel, and it says, "And the decree went forth that the wise man should be slain, and they saw Daniel and his fellows to be slain." And so now Arioch comes, and he was the commander, and so he comes to look for Daniel, and he answered and said to Arioch the king, "Captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king?" Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. So obviously Daniel lets him know, Arioch lets him know that things have gotten very hectic up in the kingdom, and so now the king has taken a rash decision, and he's going to end all the wise men in his kingdom. And so Daniel does something very special here. Remember, the wise men were asking for what? The wise men wanted time. And so then here it says Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. So there's a huge difference on what Daniel was asking and what were the wise men asking for. So what was the thing that the wise men were asking for? They both wanted time, but there was one thing that the wise men were very clear on, and that was there is no one, not even in this kingdom, there's nobody in this world that will actually tell you what the dream was and what it means, right? And so now the king knows that they're asking for time, but they know that they don't have the answer, right? They even say, only the gods will know this. But Daniel says something different. He asks the king for time. And so there is something that Daniel does that I think as Christians, is very important for us to realize. Right after the king grants him the time, he does something very special. And in verse 17, it tells us that Daniel goes back. He goes back into his house, and he goes to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and his companions. And this is why it's very important for us to have a close faith-based community, because in times like these, remember, the lives of these men were at stake. Daniel and his friends as well. So who does he go to? He goes to his friends, and they begin to pray. And so when we go to verse 18, it says that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning the secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men in Babylon. And so now I would like us to go ahead and look very briefly before we go into the vision that he had. We're going to look and analyze a little bit the prayer of Daniel. And there are some very specific things that I would like us to consider here. So Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changeth the times and the seasons." What does God do here? This is going to become very relevant when we come to later on in the book of Daniel, when there's going to be an entity that we're going to touch on that wants to do what? That it wants to change the times and the seasons, right? And so Daniel is acknowledging that the God, the Creator God, is the only one that can change the times and the seasons. Then he keeps going in verse 20. It says, "He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding." And then in verse 22 through 23, it says, "He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth in him." So after he has this prayer, God reveals to him the dream. And then Daniel says this, "I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hath made known unto me now what we desired of thee, for thou hast made known unto us the king's matter." And so in verse 31, it says, "Thou, O king," and so now he begins to tell the king what this vision actually is. And then it says, "Thou, O king, sawest and behold a great image. This great image," in the Hebrew, this word terrible simply means that this image was it was fearful. This was a fearful image, and it was an image that inspires some sort of awe or reverence. And so now this is more or less what the statue probably looked like. And so now we're going to begin to look at Daniel's description of the dream. And so we start with a head of gold. And Daniel says in verse 32 that this image's head was of fine gold. And then in verse 37, it tells us the explanation later on in a couple of verses down. It says, "Thou, O king, art the King of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom." And it says that this kingdom was going to receive power, strength, and it was going to receive glory as well. And so we're going to focus just on the word strength here. And so when you go to the Hebrew, the word strength here this has nothing to do with what we would call strength, but it has to do with wealth and riches. And so pretty much the way the Babylonian Empire exerted its strength was through money. And as we know, in any type of government, when you have the money talks. And so they had a lot of money. And Daniel makes it very clear that this kingdom was the head of gold, and so is the kingdom that had the most amount of money. And so in verse 38 it says, "And wheresoever the children of men dwell," he continues to explain here the vision. It says, "The beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee a ruler over them all, that thou art the head of gold." So how do we know that? So he tells the king, the head of gold, this is actually you. So when we go to some of the findings, that this is called the Hod of Hammurabi, and this is one of the archaeological pieces that offer perhaps the most evidence for what the Bible tells us in regards to Babylon. And one of the things that this writings and inscription tells us about Babylon is that one of the things that made Babylon very, very rich was the way that they were positioned, right? So they were strategically positioned. And so I don't have the map here, but when you go home, you can look it up. And when you look where Babylon was, it was in a position where they could very well trade with other governments as well. And so their biggest strength was trade. And because of the place where they were in the map, this allowed them to export a lot of goods, to get a lot of goods into Babylon. And so one of the things that they exchanged a lot were like spices, textiles, metals. And so this made Babylon even richer and richer because they were very good with trading. And so again, if you follow the news, what scares people the most when it comes to trading? When you have two countries and they get into a trade war, it's not nice. And so this was one of their biggest strengths. Now, when you look at what is inscribed in this, what people call the Code of Hammurabi, one of the things that lets us know that Babylon was a very advanced civilization is that, believe it or not, they actually were perhaps the first government that had minimum wage. And so there they had what people should be making minimally. And there was another thing, is that they had laws in regards to property, and surprisingly, they had some very well-structured laws when it came to marriage. And so they were very well-structured, and so they had all sorts of laws. So when you have time, you can look it over. So very interesting things. When you look at their marriage laws, it's very similar to what we have in the U.S. Nowadays. So anyway, so this was Babylon. So now we're going to go to the next phase of this vision that Daniel has. And so, as you know, the next part of this vision was the chest and the arms, which was made out of silver. And so in Daniel chapter 2, verse 32, it says that his breast and his arms were of silver. And again, this first vision, where we have the list of these kingdoms, the only one identified here is going to be Babylon. Later on, when we get into the other chapters, is going to pretty much break it down for us, but this one does not tell us. So his breast and his arms were of silver. And then Daniel explains to him what this was, and it says, "And after thee shall arise another kingdom," but he adds that this kingdom was going to be inferior. And so now we're going to be looking at another piece of archaeology that tells us and gives us a little bit more light as to what this kingdom was. And so when we go to this piece, I'm sure most of you have seen it. and this is called the Cyrus cylinder. This is if you look at the translation, this is amazing. But this is a clay cylinder, and it's inscribed with the account of Cyrus the Great and his conquest of Babylon. And one of the interesting things here, when we look at the Medo-Persian government, was that they were very good at tolerating other religions. Okay, so when the Medo-Persians come into the picture, they come to Babylon, and they actually were very nice to the Babylonians. They accommodated the people so they could continue to worship their Babylonian religion. And one of the things that they did very well is that some of the temples that needed to be repaired, they actually began to repair those Babylonian temples. And so it is very interesting what they would do. Later on, this became perhaps one of their weakest points because they were very accepting of other religions, and so this was perhaps one of the reasons why they fell later on. But the other interesting thing is that this cylinder has also been recognized as a symbol of human rights. And if you go to the United Nations building, they actually have it in display. And so they actually did like a celebration in 1971, and they were celebrating the 2,500th year anniversary of this empire because they value, many religions, right? And so very interesting on how they approached the conquest of Babylon. We're going to go to the next phase here, and this is going to be the belly and the thighs of bronze. And in Daniel 2:32, it says his belly and thighs were of brass. And in verse 39, the explanations comes in, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And so these were, when we look at here, this is a very interesting proof. These are some Persian coins. And there, if you look at some of the Greek coins as well, you will find that these Persian coins were found in the area of Turkey, and so this shows us how the Greeks conquered the Medo-Persians, and you will find coins from both of these kingdoms in each of these places. Now, one of the things that I find very interesting is that if you're going back here, this part of this kingdom right here, the kingdom of Greece is represented with a medal of bronze. Now, when you look at the armor that the Greek soldiers had, it's very interesting that their armor was made out of bronze as well. And later on, when we go to the Roman Empire, you're going to see that the metals used in their armor was iron, incidentally. And so this soldier here, you'll see that all of his, the metals that is used in his armor is going to be brass. Now, we're going to go now into the legs. And in verse 33, it says that his legs were of iron. And then in verse 40, it says, and the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And so when we look at the history of the Roman government, one of the things that we realize is that they were very, very brutal. At some points, there's a historian that describes one conquest that the Romans had, and whenever you had somebody that would, rise up against the kingdom, they would go ahead and crucify each and every one of them. And so there's this historian that describes that as they were coming out of the city, they would see miles and miles and miles of people that were crucified because they did something against the Roman government. And so the Roman government was very brutal, and we have perfect examples of that in the story of Christ. And again, when we look at the armor of the Roman soldier, like I mentioned, everything was made of iron as well. So now I would like us to focus a little bit on the feet. And again, we're not going to get into the kingdom specifically in this study, but now we have the feet of iron and clay. And later on, we're going to look at how this was the divided Europe. And in verse 33, it says that his feet, part of iron and part of clay. And so this tells us that now these governments were going to be partly influenced by the Roman government. They were going to have the strength of the iron, but they were also going to be clay as well. And then Daniel in verse 41, he explains what it actually means. And it says, "And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it the strength of the iron, inasmuch as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay." And so he goes on to say in verse 42, "And as the toes of the feet were part of the iron and part of the clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken." And then it says, "And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with the miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay." So now, when we look at the history of Western Europe, you will see that a lot of times they try to kind of come together through marriage to kind of make it work, but that never worked. So we're not going to focus on that tonight, but there's a story that I would like to share with you, which I found very, very interesting. So when you go to Europe, there's one place that I believe that you should visit because you're going to find a lot of interesting things, specifically when it comes to the unification of Europe and all of these attempts that have been done. And this is in France, and it's called the Metz Cathedral. Now, the Metz Cathedral, it's very interesting because if you go on the outside, I haven't been there, but I'm planning to be there. But if you go on the outside, there is this statue, and this statue is the statue of the prophet Daniel, right? And as you can see from the picture, this is the actual picture. He's actually pointing to the scroll. Now, there was this guy, and you can look him up. His name was Kaiser Wilhelm. And so he was a very, very wealthy guy. And so when they were, at some point, the roof needed some sort of repair. And so whenever a church needs repair, what do? You go ahead and call the guy that has the most money, and you ask him, "Hey, can you give us a hand to go ahead and fix the roof?" And so obviously they came, they approached Kaiser, this guy here, and the way that he responded was very interesting. Again, Kaiser had always had a deep passion to unify Europe and to make Europe, united, but they approached him, and now he answered and said, "Hey, I'm willing to do the repair for the cathedral. I'll do everything, but there's one condition." And what do you think that condition was? The condition was, take Daniel's head from this statue, and you're going to replace it with my head. And again, he was very passionate with unifying Europe. And so what do you, I am sure, now there's no evidence for this, but I'm pretty sure that he knew what the prophecy of Daniel said, right? And the prophecy was that these 10 kingdoms were never going to unite. They were going to try and mingle, but they were never going to unite. And so what do you think the church did? They needed the money. And so, again, when they would build these statues, I am told that they're done in sections. So you don't do the whole statue. You probably start with the feet and work your way up. And so the head was easy to take off. And so the church needed the money, and they went ahead and got rid of the head. They took the head, took it, I'm guessing some in the basement or the archives. And so they went ahead and put his head, Kaiser's head, on this statue. And I don't know why he chose Daniel, but he did choose Daniel to go ahead and replace his head on that statue. So later on, they brought it up, but he had something against Daniel, and I believe that most likely it was because he was very passionate about unifying Europe, and Daniel, in the vision, said, this is not going to happen. Later on, they asked him, why, the unification never happened in Europe, and the way that he describes it is, it seemed as if God was preventing this to happen. So they were doing the best that they could, but somehow this never worked. So now we finally come to the last kingdom that is mentioned in this vision. And this is the stone that was cut off without hands, and it comes and smashes this statue to smithereens. And in Daniel chapter 2, verse 34, it says, Thou sawest until a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and broke them to pieces. And then in verse 44, it says, And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And so one of the last questions that I would like to leave with you tonight is, when we look at our lives, there are a lot of things that we want to be in control of. And when we look at the story of Nebuchadnezzar, I feel like we can relate with him more than we would like to admit, right? We like to be in control of things. And if we look at the history of every kingdom, later on we're going to look a little bit closely to those kingdoms. But when we look at the history of those kingdoms, each of these kings held on to their kingdoms with their own lives, right? And so, but one of the lessons that we learn is that at the very end, God is the one that removes kings, God is the one that puts kings, and everything is in God's control. And so I believe that we can trust God and surrender our lives to His keeping, because we know that at the very end, the promise is that He's going to come and He's going to take us back home. Amen?